Hello, Stephen Bedard here. The question I want to ask is this. Were James and Paul in the New Testament, were they enemies? Did they have completely different understandings of the gospel? And would they have seen each other as opponents? There are those who believe that, there was a tremendous amount of conflict between them. In fact, some people see the history of the early church in terms of the Hegelian model of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And so they would say that it began with a Jewish form of Christianity that was reflected in the teachings of James. And then came Paul's Gentile or Hellenistic version of Christianity, and that those two were in conflict. And then eventually they were able to experience a synthesis, which became what we know as Orthodox Christianity. But is that the case? So first of all, who are these two important leaders in the early church? Well, there's numerous different people named James found in the New Testament. The James that we're talking about is not the Apostle James in the sense of one of the 12. James, son of Zebedee, he was actually one of the first apostles to be killed, as described in the book of Acts. This James was the brother of Jesus, or half-brother of Jesus. We're told in the Gospels that Mary and Joseph had numerous other children. And in the lists of names that we find there, James is always listed first, which suggests that he was the oldest of the children born after Jesus. And we're also told in the Gospels that James and his brothers and sisters did not believe that Jesus was who he claimed to be, which we have to give some grace there. It would be very difficult if your sibling claimed to be the Son of God and to be the Messiah. There would probably be some tension there, so we can understand that. We find in 1 Corinthians 15 that Jesus made a special resurrection appearance to his brother James, and it seems that that is the turning point in James' life, and he becomes not only a follower of Jesus, but he becomes the leader of the church in Jerusalem. When you go through the book of Acts, it looks at the beginning like Peter has taken over as leader, but Peter is not really the administrative type, and so he's an evangelist, missionary, that type of leader. And so James, the brother of Jesus, ends up taking over as leader in Jerusalem. So when it comes to the question, are the Gentiles welcome into the church, or do they have to convert to Judaism, you see James giving leadership over that. And then we also have the Apostle Paul, who was originally known as Saul of Tarsus, who encounters Christ after a time of persecuting the church, and he becomes very zealous for the Lord, and he finds himself focusing on Gentiles, that is non-Jews, and sharing the gospel with them. So how do these two people interact, and what is their relationship? Well, you can understand why some people would think that there might be some tension there. And you know what? I'm going to put my cards out and say I think there actually was some tension. But it's not necessarily based on what people think. And so the one example that is often shared is that Paul in Galatians and in Romans uses the example of Abraham as why we are saved by faith and not works. That it is simply that Abraham believed and it was reckoned unto him as righteousness. And so it is not about works. And yet when we go to the letter of James, we have James using that same passage to demonstrate that faith without works is dead. And some people have thought that James wrote that in response to Paul, that he was trying to correct the false teaching of Paul, that we are saved just by faith, whereas James wants us to see that we are saved by faith and works. And that is actually not really the case. When you look at them, you see that Paul and James were actually talking about two totally different things. Paul was talking about how one becomes a Christian. And he was indicating that it is not by the following of the law. It is not any of those things. It's simply by putting our faith in Christ. And that's how we are justified. That's how we are reckoned to be righteous. James is not looking at how one becomes a Christian. He's looking at what does the Christian life look like. And what it looks like is a faith that is demonstrated by works. And so if we claim to be Christians and we say we have faith in Christ, but there's no evidence, there's nothing that we're doing where we don't care about the poor, we don't care about the marginalized, we don't care about any of those things, we just sit back and soak up the blessings, James would say there's a problem there. Faith without works is dead. And I think if you got Paul and James in the same room and put that passage of Abraham in front of them and ask them to work that out, that they would both agree that we are saved by faith, but that that faith needs to be revealed through works. It's our works that is the fruit of that. As a Christian, once we are a Christian, those works are important. In fact, Paul actually talks about that in Ephesians, that we were predestined for good works. And he has that in a passage where he's talking about us being saved by faith alone. So he still values the importance of works. But I said that there was some tension. And part of the tension probably was the fact that a lot of the opponents that Paul faced were probably from the Jerusalem church. People who struggled with this idea that Gentiles could become followers of Jesus without converting to Judaism, without taking on the law and being circumcised. Now, James agreed that Gentiles had direct access to Jesus and they did not need to follow the law. But it looks as if a lot of the people who were in James' church and in his circle were the people who were giving Paul a hard time. And so that probably created some tension. You get some hints of that as well. We actually have a passage in Galatians that refers to a meeting with James and Paul, among other people. And I think it is worth taking a look at, as it gives us some sense of what the relationship between these two men were. So this is what Paul shares in chapter 2. He says this, 14 years later, I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. I took Titus along also. I went in response to a revelation and set before them the gospel that I preach among the Gentiles. But I did this privately to those who seemed to be leaders, for fear that I was running or had run my race in vain. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, even though he was a Greek. This matter arose because some false brothers had infiltrated our ranks to spy on the freedom we have in Christ Jesus, and to make us slaves. We did not give in to them for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might remain with you. As for those who seemed to be important, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God does not judge by external appearance. Those men added nothing to my message. On the contrary, they saw that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, just as Peter had been to the Jews. For God, who was at work in the ministry of Peter as an apostle to the Jews, was also at work in my ministry as an apostle to the Gentiles. James, Peter, and John, those reputed to be pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the Jews, and all they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. And that's Galatians chapter 2, verses 1 to 10. And so you get a sense there that there is a little bit of tension there. When he says, as for those who seemed to be important, and he wants to be very careful that he doesn't rely on the authority of James and Peter and John for his apostleship. He wants to be understood as receiving his apostleship directly from Christ, and his authority does not derive from these human leaders. So he is distancing himself somewhat, but not in the message. All he wants his readers to know is that he is an apostle called by Jesus Christ. And the apostles in Jerusalem, they're doing what God called them to do, and God bless them. But that is not something that Paul has to worry about. That they are sharing the same gospel, but they have a different focus. They're focusing on the Jews. He's focusing on the Gentiles. And together they're all remembering the poor, and everything's fine. But he just gets a couple of little almost zingers in there to demonstrate that he does not rely on the authority of James or anyone else. And so I am sure that just as there are Christians today who might have a different focus and a different passion, and who are zealous for a specific aspect of Christian ministry, maybe they're around other people who have different priorities, and they just kind of shake their head and just don't quite understand why they're doing it the way they're doing it, but at least see each other as being on the same team. I think that something like that was going on with Paul and James. I don't think that they were the kind of people that would hang out and be best friends and just enjoy each other's company all the time. They were very different in personality, very different in focus, but they shared the same gospel, a gospel that was based on faith in Jesus, and one that would eventually be demonstrated in Christian life. Both James and Paul would agree on that. So were they enemies? No, I don't think that they were enemies. Were they best friends? Probably not. Were they brothers in Christ? Absolutely. James and Paul, they are very important people for us to look at and to learn from, and perhaps we would find one or the other as our own inspiration. Thank you for watching this video. I would encourage you to check out my website, historyofchristianitypodcast.com. Thank you, and God bless.